Hello friends and welcome back to BuildALot Acres. In today's episode we're going to talk about the Arien's GT line. Stay tuned.
So like Brett said, today's video is going to be all about the Arien's GT line, which was a garden tractor line of theirs from the late 70s through the 80s and even into the early 90s for some of the models. Now, Arien's is a well-known company. They're actually based out of Brillion, Wisconsin, which is a small town, and they've been based out of there since 1933 when Henry Ariens and his three sons, Steve, Leon, and Francis, started making snow blowers and it transitioned into a bunch of different garden tractor line items through the years.
Now, as many of you probably know, Arien's is known as the King of Snow, being renowned for their two-stage blowers, which started in 1960 with the infamous snow throw.
So like Brett said, the Arien's line really became infamous, I would say, with a snow blower and then transitioned. And they also bought Gravely back in 1982. But for today's video, we're going to be focusing on the GT line. I don't own any Arien's products other than my Zero Turn, which is newer. I don't have any older garden tractors or snow throws or anything from Arien's, but that'd be cool to compile a list and some different facts and features to showcase the Arien's line. Hope you enjoyed today's video. So prior to the GT series would have been the S series from Arien's, which would have been from about 1974 till 1978, and then starting in 1979 is when the GT series took over. So let's get into the first model.
So the first model and the smallest model was the GT10G, which was only available in 1979.
And it was only available in a gear version, hence the G. You'll see the other models are mostly hydrostatic with the exception of the GT14G. So the 10 and the 14 were the two models that they offered that had gear transmission. So it was actually a Tecumseh transmission in the Arien's gear models.
Transmission or engine?
No, Tecumseh made transmissions too.
Really? I never knew that.
Yep. So what can you tell us about the GT10, Brett?
It's got a 10 horsepower single cylinder Kohler. So a very robust, very reliable engine. The same engine that's in my 220 actually. 10 horsepower Kohler K series. Weighed in at just shy of 900 pounds, so it was a heavier tractor, but nothing crazy like a Power Max or any other super GT, so to speak. Had a 48-inch wheelbase, so it had 16 by 6.5 by 8 fronts, and it had 23 by 8.5 by 12 rears. It had a 48-inch two-stage snow blower. It had a 48-inch mowing deck and a 54-inch snow blade.
So I'm going to say, because it was only made for 1 year in 1979, I would assume they did not sell that well. They probably weren't that popular, so they probably stopped making them after that first year. But I also do question some of the validness of this information. All this information I took mostly was off of Tractor Data, which is a website that features different tractors. And let me know in the comments if you're an Arien's guy or girl, did the 10 horse really run the 48-inch deck and the 48-inch two-stage blower? Because to me, in my experiences with other brands, 10 horse for that size of a blower or a deck seems like a lot. But let me know how it worked and if that is in fact the correct implement for the 10 horse model. So what do we got next, Brett?
Next up is the GT12, which is jumping ahead in time a little bit. It was only made 2 years, 1981 and 1982. So again, I would assume it didn't sell that well, again, probably because it wasn't really powerful enough.
I think a lot of people wanted bigger engines, more power. So this would have been a hydrostatic model, so obviously it was a lot different than the gear model, GT10G. And some other features you're going to notice is, you're going to notice a trend. With the exception of the diesel model, all of their models had Kohler engines, so obviously they liked Kohler engines. They all had 4.5 gallon fuel tanks, with the exception of, I think, 2 models. They all had hydrostatic transmissions. So the certain things in the implements are pretty much all the same you know, up to a certain size, then you went up to a 60-inch deck instead of a 48 for the max. But other than that, it seems like they all ran the same plows, same blowers, and the same mowing decks.
So now one thing that's on here that I don't know the validity of is that it says that for the GT10G, the GT14, the GT16G, or the GT14G, the GT14, the GT16, it says that they all weigh 895 pounds. I'm not saying that's true, I'm not saying that's false. I'm just saying I find it a little bit difficult to believe.
I found myself questioning the exact same thing, because if they have different engines,
Exactly.
how can they weigh the exact same?
That a 10 horsepower gear-driven transmission, which is going to be lighter than a hydrostatic transmission, how is it going to then weigh the exact same as a 16 horsepower engine, which is going to be bigger and has a hydrostatic transmission, which is going to be heavier?
Yeah.
How does that then weigh the exact same?
I questioned that as too. It seemed odd to me. Oh, and the other thing they all share was they all had a 48-inch wheelbase. But I questioned that myself. Again, let us know in the comments if that's true. It's possible Tractor Data took the information from one model and just put it across other models. But like Brett said, I have a hard time believing that they all weighed that exact amount. I'm not saying they weren't close to that, but that exact amount for that many different models seems hard to believe with different engines. So next up would have been the GT14G, which, as I alluded to earlier in the video, this was the other model that you could get in a gear version, but you could also get the GT14, the hydrostatic version, whereas the 10 horse was only available in a geared model. And you're going to see that a lot across different brands. Is the lowest, smallest model is usually the gear model. The hydrostatics were kind of considered like luxury transmissions for garden tractors back in the day. Even to an extent now they are. So the GT14G was made for 2 years, 1979 and 1980, whereas the GT14 with the hydrostatic transmission was made from 1979 to 1982. So almost twice as long. And again, I'm going to suppose that was probably due to the hydrostatic transmission being a more popular, better selling choice.
So next up after that, we have the GT16, which was made again from 1979 to 1982. So I'm going to assume that it was one of their more popular models, at least in the beginning. Because if you really think about it, it was like a mid-range model. You know, that it was bigger than the 10, the 12, the 14, but still smaller than some of the bigger models that they had around the same time. You know, 16 horsepower Kohler.
So it was also the biggest single-cylinder model they offered. Once you stepped up to the GT17, it went to 2 cylinders, and all the models above that were 2 cylinders, including the diesel, which we're going to discuss in a little bit. But going back to the GT16, you're going to notice again a lot of the same specs. Kohler engine, 48-inch wheelbase, 895 pounds. Let us know if that's correct. 4.5 gallon fuel tank, 16-inch front tires, 23-inch rear tires. Pretty standard for most garden tractors of any brand. Very common tire size, brand to brand, front and rear. And then this was the largest model that you could only get the 48-inch deck on. Once you went up to the 17 and above, you could get a 60-inch deck on those models.
And so, as my father just said, next up's going to be the GT17, which was a 17 horsepower, 2-cylinder Kohler. And this one was apparently pretty popular because they kept it going for 8 years, from 1979 to 1987.
Quite a difference from the GT16 to 17 in the years produced.
So what I'm going to assume is that since this is the second biggest model that they made, starting in 1979, since start of the run, a lot of people are like, oh, well, we don't need the biggest, baddest model, you know, we just need something comparable. And so the GT17 would have been a slightly less expensive option to do that with. So I'm assuming that's why they had it running for 8 years.
And then, like we said, that's the first model that you could get 2-cylinder engine, and the first model that you could get a 60-inch deck, but all the other features from wheelbase to tire size to fuel tank size pretty much stayed the same.
But one thing that I find
odd, I know what you're going to say. The weight.
Yeah.
Supposedly,
the weight went down.
It is possible that the single cylinder
was a bigger engine
than the 2-cylinder, and the weight did go down. But supposedly the GT17 went from 895 pounds for the GT16 down 33 pounds to 862. But again, weights is definitely one of the things I question on these tractor data specs. I've seen them misquote other brands that I know the weights of because I have owner's manuals, so I'm not real confident in the weights, but I wrote down what I was able to find. So next up we have
the GT18, which is the most popular GT model. At least according to how long it was produced for. Because it was produced for 12 years.
That's pretty impressive.
From 79 to 91, which is a pretty long time for a single tractor to be out.
So I would say I definitely see the most GT18s. I see a lot of 19s, and I would say I see a lot of 20s. But there was one other GT18 model that was very unique, and that is
the GT18D, which was the diesel-powered option.
That would have been an 18 horsepower, 2-cylinder Ruggieri diesel, which from my research was actually made in the exact same factory in Italy as the Lombardini diesels, which you've seen on a lot of other guide tractors of other brands.
Only made from 84 to 87, so it had a 4-year production run. I think what really held this model back is that I'm assuming that because it was a diesel and because the engine was from Italy, it was probably the most expensive out of all of them.
And it was probably harder to get parts for.
That's true too, that Kohler is an American company. And if you need Kohler parts, they are very common. You can find them anywhere. And even if you need to get them from Kohler, it doesn't take that long to get them shipped to your house.
Well, look at the weight on that baby. 1,060 pounds.
Oh, that's a heavy tractor.
It's a beefy tractor. It would be cool. Let me just know. I don't know that I've ever seen one of these in person. I've seen a lot of Ariens, but I don't believe I've ever seen one of the 18D models. So let us know if you have one, or if you know someone that has one, or if you used to own one. That's really cool if you do. So what's next, Brett?
Up next is the GT19. So this is where we start getting into the bigger tractors not being produced until later. So with the exception of the GT12, for every tractor from the GT10G to the GT18 was made starting in 1979. And the GT12 was started to be made in 81, which is the same year as the GT19. So the GT19 had a production run from 81 to 87. And it has pretty similar specs to the GT18, correct?
Yeah, pretty much the exact same other than the weight. Again, it went down in weight despite being a bigger engine, which doesn't make any sense, but we'll leave that to the audience to try to help us figure out. And let's move on to the biggest of the GT models, which was
the GT20, which, again, the only differences are the engine is slightly bigger and the weight went down.
So, I mean, if you look at these models, and, you know, obviously we're going to have pictures on the screen to show you, but there's really not much of a difference looks-wise, model to model. They all kind of look the same. If you look at them from a distance, anyone other than a die-hard Ariens fan probably wouldn't be able to tell which model is which. You know, the biggest differences really were the engines. So they say that the Ariens GT line was actually modeled after the New Holland line of garden tractors, which, as you're going to see, they really do look quite similar. I can't say for certain whether this is true or not. Maybe someone else can chime in the comment section, but they certainly do appear to be modeled after the New Holland line of garden tractors. So we talked about all the GT models, but there is one other model that we want to discuss.
The Grand Sierra 2200, made from 1996 to 2001.
Yeah, you're going to notice, not only does this have the biggest engine at 22 horsepower Kohler, it's also got a much different look. It's got a much more round hood. It does not have the same, you know, classic look that the other Ariens GT models had. And it's technically not a GT model. It's a different model. It's a standalone model. But it's pretty unique, and we wanted to include it in today's video.
Also, we both feel that it makes the most sense being put with the GT line versus their LT line or any other line. Thank you guys for watching today's video on the Ariens GT line. Please enjoy this selection of vintage Arien machines at work.